Okay, I'd just like to, on behalf of the movement, on behalf of Johnny and Maura's family, just like to welcome you all here today for the Johnny White, Politics of Johnny White Memorial Lecture. I would first like to call on Johnny's son Kieran, who's going to say a few words on behalf of the family.
I suppose I'd just like to say thanks for everybody turning out today, and I'd like to thank Terry there for organising it. I suppose when he died there, like, nobody really knew what he was all about, like. And what to say, honestly, I thought when it, didn't really know him, like, what he done, because everything was kind of kept a secret. And once he died, like, I suppose everybody thought that was going to be it, like, as a good man he's supposed to be. And I'd just like to thank Terry and Martin there for keeping his name on, like, and I suppose that's it.
The next man I'm going to call up now is a man, if you all know, is a man of few words. Tommy McCourt.
I'm a man of few words. I'm not buying no drinking away. When this was first talked about, and Terry had suggested that something like this should be done, obviously people like myself and others who knew Johnny were more than happy to be associated with it and to participate. And when I was asked if I'd say a few words, I felt it would be really difficult to try and explain to people who didn't know Johnny, and even to those who did, but maybe didn't know the depth and the extent of Johnny's involvement. It would be really difficult to try and explain that for any one person, never mind for a couple. So it was kind of suggested that it could be done in two sort of ways. One is to talk about Johnny as the individual, the man, the person, the human being, and for another part of it to talk more about his political viewpoints and the struggles that he'd been involved in. And that's the way this was kind of put together. And I was asked if I would speak because I would consider myself a personal friend of Johnny for a long, long time, and I've spent many a time, hard times and good times with Johnny. And so what I would just like to do is just generally talk about him and some of the stuff that I can't share all of it obviously, but at least some of it to give people a picture of Johnny and the depth and the struggles that Johnny was involved in. I first met Johnny, I think it was around about 1966, so somebody said nearly 50 years ago. It's hard to credit, but basically our first involvement in politically or collaboration in terms of that was around 1968, and October the 5th march, the first march in Derry, where Johnny White in truth was the driving force behind those marches, with people like Eamon McCann, Dermot McCann and a few others. But Johnny, in my mind, was the kind of motivation and the strength that pushed that march through and made sure that the struggle that we've all come through actually started. And it was almost single-handedly, I would suggest, that Johnny White was the person responsible mainly for that. And at the time he was involved with some of the comrades still about, Peter Collins and people like Raymond Norby, different people, Michael Montgomery, who's dead. These were the young men at that time who saw the problems in Northern Ireland and saw the evil in this state and tried their best to motivate people like myself and others who hadn't a great deal of politics at that time, to motivate the likes of us to get involved and try and do something about the system. And that's when I first collaborated with Johnny. Johnny at a particular point in time had a disagreement with the Republican movement and had temporarily resigned, and I at that stage was secretary of the Young Socialists in Derry, and I met Johnny, and I was trying to persuade Johnny that having left the Republican movement he should join them, as I said, the revolutionaries and the Young Socialists. As it turned out, things actually went the other way around. We all left the Young Socialists and joined Johnny in the Republican movement. But that was the beginning of the Troubles, as it's now defined, in terms of what happened in 1968. Everybody's aware of the marches, and then the lead up to 1969 and the riots, the Troubles and so on. And it was the first time people like myself and others who even ever heard of or thought of guns ever been produced or seen. And it was the first time I'd seen any person with a weapon. I'm obviously not going to get on the names of individuals, but that was the kind of atmosphere that we were living in at the time. It was the revolution. We were standing the world on its head. We were changing the system. We were in the sort of format of Bob Dylan and the radical civil rights movement in America and the Paris students. We believed we were doing the same thing. And Johnny White essentially embodied that to people like myself. We began to look to Johnny. He was just a natural leader. He was someone that you felt you could rely on, someone whose judgment you could trust, and that through that many of us became involved in what was then the official Republican movement. And the main reason we got involved in the official Republican movement as opposed to the emerging provisionals was because of Johnny White. It was because we knew Johnny, we had trusted him, and we believed in his judgment, and many of us were unsure as to which is the way forward. There were two options. There was the provisionals emerging, there was what was the official Republican movement. And because Johnny was associated with the officials, in many cases that's why some of us just said we're going there, because if he's there, that's where we should be. And that's where we ended up in it. And in the early days of the officials in Derry, in 1970, 1969, 1970, 1971, the Free Derry period, it was a time when young men went on the streets literally 24 hours a day. Cars were filled with weapons. People drove throughout the areas, constant gun battles, constant sleeping in other people's houses. And Johnny was a leader that controlled, in a sense, and gave direction to us in that particular element of the struggle. And I remember many's and many's a night being in Mrs. White's house up in Craigan. At that particular time, it was very common for families, their homes turned into basically headquarters. You know, my mother's in the bog was like that, Darren McLennan's house like that. You know, Johnny's house in Craigan was very popular for that. There were all sorts of houses that was kept open for volunteers to call in for their soup in the middle of the night. And it was a hectic, constant struggle, gun battles, constantly on the streets, manning barricades. And Johnny had the, I suppose, fortune or misfortune, depending on how you look at it, of being the person that everybody went to when something went wrong, or when you needed guidance, or when you wanted to complain, or when you wanted something done. Johnny was the person, and Johnny tried to live in the middle of all that a life with a partner, Maura, a life of a family, trying to have a family and have a life in it. And I remember some of the activities that were involved in, and one particular one I want to just refer to was on one occasion there was a gun battle in Craigan. It was in St. Peter's School, and went on from early in the morning to late in the afternoon. And it was a unit of the IRA led by Johnny took over the top of the school, and the shooting went from morning to night, as I said. The British Army tried to come down the field and couldn't get them and were held back. They then came up the back of St. Peter's. Johnny led the unit out of St. Peter's and down into Hyde Park and ambushed the army from the side as they came up. And it was a kind of quality of Johnny that in the midst of this heavy shooting and so on, Johnny kept his cool, saw the opportunities, and kept that unit together during that entire struggle. And as a result of that struggle, I often recall the newspaper cuttings the next day where the British Army declared it was the biggest land battle in Ireland since the rising in 1916. And that has never really been talked about. But Johnny White led the biggest land battle in Ireland from 1916. And that was the nature of Johnny. It was in St. Peter's School. Johnny also was a person who had a very, very dedicated and very deep understanding of what the differences in his view was between the provisional Republican movement and the officials. Many of us didn't really understand that. Many of us just had a loyalty. But Johnny actually saw the difference. And Johnny was someone who asserted constantly the need for the socialist element of national politics, the need to unite the class question and the national question. And Johnny would have argued, and I remember constantly confrontations in the bog, down at the barricades, with people like Mark McGuinness, Some people whose names are all over the place now as leaders of the struggle. And I seen Johnny White standing face to face with him and telling him where to go. And not one of them had the courage or the ability to try and face him down. Johnny stood up to him, and Johnny stood up for it because he believed in the socialism. And I remember the slogans that the organisation today, which claims to be some kind of socialist organisation of provisionals, I remember the slogans on the brandy bottle which said better dead than red. I remember them when they said, when they criticised the street committees because they said it was communist. Suddenly their politics have all changed. Johnny's never changed, and the official Republican movement at that particular time embodied that. As it went on, obviously the official Republican movement itself changed, and with that, new struggles emerged, and Johnny was again before that. Motorman changed the situation in Derry. When the British Army decided to come in, some of us, in fact at that particular time nearly everybody, ended up in Buncrana or somewhere over the border, at least for a short period of time. And one of the things that sticks out in my mind was we had a meeting, and McCourt, who was then a representative for the IRA Council in Dublin, met with us in Buncrana and said that they had had a meeting with the then leadership of the RUC and the British representatives in Derry, and that they had been told that every member of the official Republican movement, because the official Republican movement had been declaring a ceasefire, that every member of the official Republican movement could come home, but they would not be charged, that there would be no charges, except for 3 people. And the 3 people named was myself, Johnny, and Seamus O'Kane. And we were told at that time that if any of us 3 was caught in Derry, we would be charged with any offence that the official Republican movement had been guilty of, that we would be charged with it. It turned out that that was a total and absolute lie. McCourt had told us that in order to make sure that the leadership as it existed in Derry at that time would be split up. And it ended up that people like Johnny ended up in Limerick, I ended up in Dublin, Seamus O'Kane ended up in Donegal, Terry was in Derry, there was other members of the movement. They split up the movement in the city because they saw the leadership of the city as a threat to the then leadership of the official Republican movement. And as a result of Motorman, Johnny White began what can be described, I think, as a poverty-stricken existence over the border. As I said, I ended up in Dublin. Johnny initially was in Limerick, and Johnny lived with absolutely no money. He was a man, and I've seen people making money out of the troubles. See people running around today with their big suits and their cars. Johnny White never made a penny, and I can stand on that. I know from personal experience with Johnny, he had never made a penny out of the troubles, and his family suffered every bit as much as he did, and stood by him through that when they lived in poverty in places like Limerick. When they moved to Dublin and lived in a block of flats in Dublin, and I was squatting in a house in Dublin at that particular time, and when I left the house that I was squatting in, we moved Johnny's family into it, and that was the nature of life that we were living at that particular time. And when I hear people talking about the revolution and all the rest of them, half of them never knew what it was like to live away from your home, to try and rear a family with no money, to be harassed every step of your life by the guards in one case or the peelers up in the north here, and be blackened by the organisation that you had actually lived for and helped you build, who then lied about you and tried to blacken. And that's what the official Republican movement did on Johnny White. Johnny White, as I say, lived through all of that poverty, subsequently moving, as I say, to Dublin, eventually back to Letterkenny, and then eventually back into Derry. And I remember bringing Johnny back into Derry. I remember picking him up, him and Maura, out in Letterkenny. And it was on the basis of that particular time when we found out the lies that McCourt had told to keep us out of the city. When a second approach was made a long time later, that we were told that there was no charges outstanding against any of us, that if we were arrested we would certainly have to face interrogation. But the lie that was told was a deliberate lie. And Johnny and people like myself were forced on their own, not just by the British, but by the organisation that we had tried to build, who had deliberately told lies to keep us out of the city, to try to destroy the leadership in the city. As a result of many of the conflicts that went on within the official Republican movement, and the way in which the official Republican movement finally ended up going down the road of supposedly democratising Northern Ireland, the same path that the provisionals are on at the present minute. When we went down that road, many of us felt that was the wrong direction, and we left the Republican movement. Some of us left it, some of us forced out. I was suspended at the door of the RDS. People like Johnny were suspended, Seamus Costello was suspended, Terry, people all around the north who were standing up and trying to change the leadership of the movement were forced out, blackened, articles were written about us, and Johnny again suffered at the hands of that. Johnny's function, and I remember him coming to Dublin and meeting me, and a couple of us were sitting having a wee drink, sitting talking about other times, and as Johnny said, look, it's as simple as this: if we don't get together and if we don't try and build something new, and if we don't try and create an alternative, then the next time we meet, let's just talk about sex, or let's sit and talk about fishing or something, because we can't just go on pretending to be revolutionaries. And it was that sort of motivation coming from Johnny that many of us decided that it was time that we hooked ourselves to the ship of Seamus Costello to help build the emerging organisation which became the IRSP and the Irish National Liberation Army. And Johnny White again was to the forefront of that, driving around the country, organising people, trying to get people ready, knowing that the split was coming. And when the split happened, when I was at the RDS in Dublin and Seamus Costello, I was barred from the door, and I went over and I remember the words of saying to Seamus, I remember saying it's a bit in docket. And Seamus turned around and says, well, we have to set someone else. But the wheels had already been set in motion. Johnny had spoken to people in Norway, Terry had spoken to people in Derry, Johnny Flynn and people had done summer work in Belfast, Cork, and so very, very quickly the seeds that had been sown were put together, and a meeting was held in the Spa Hotel in Lucan, and the Irish Republican Socialist Party and the Irish National Liberation Army was born. And Johnny White, as a natural leader, was immediately selected by all and everybody there as the Adjutant General for the Irish National Liberation Army, second in command to Seamus Costello. And even at that, when Johnny was given that, what you call it, prestigious, I suppose, role as an Adjutant General, and I've seen other people in other organisations who, once they get that type of position, feel that they're above the ordinary work, that they are the leaders, it's other people that are the foot soldiers. But I remember when Johnny White was Adjutant General of the ANLA, on a Friday nights, me and him and others were walking around pubs in Dublin selling the Starry Plough. He was never above the work that was needed, no matter what his movement position was or what prestige he had or what power he had or anything else. Johnny never asked other people to do something that he wouldn't do himself. And that was the nature of Johnny White. The movement that we got involved in, the Irish Republican Socialist Party, went through a baptism of fire. Many of its leaders were killed. People like Ronnie Bunton, people like Miriam Daly, in my view, were picked on, assassinated deliberately with the instigation of the British state. Some of them were killed by other Republican, so-called Republican organisations. Internal feuds were sponsored and encouraged. Some innocent people died. Other people, I believe, were encouraged by MI5 to produce all that. And in the midst of those splits, Johnny White worked tirelessly. I remember the leaderships, as we would maybe file them, there was a leadership in Belfast, there was a leadership in Dublin, there was a leadership in Derry, and everybody was trying to figure out who the real leadership was and so on. And even through all that, Johnny White, I remember him making an arrangement to come up and meet me in Letterkenny. And the situation in that movement was so bad that I was actually questioning whether or not I was being set up by Johnny White. And I remember talking to Johnny about it afterwards, and Johnny looked at me and he says, Jesus, Tommy, you didn't really believe I would go that far. And I said, Johnny, I always believed that you would do whatever was necessary if it was needed. And he started laughing. He said, you're probably right. But that was Johnny. Friendship was friendship, but politics was supreme. And we laughed about the fact about that afterwards. Johnny, like many of us, suffered through that whole splits in the IRSP and disillusionment and people falling out and people being killed and comrades being jailed and where to go. And Johnny, like others, found themselves at a loose end, found themselves unsure as to where the movement was going. But Johnny's commitment to politics never ever changed. Like many of the people in this room, despite the fact that they've gone and moved on or moved to different things or given up at certain points, their politics has always been in their hearts and never will change. And Johnny even moved as far as joining Sinn Féin in Donegal and worked for them tirelessly. and worked in their offices and so on. But Johnny was never at home in Sinn Féin, and Johnny admitted that, and he said that he needed to be involved in politics. It was the only thing available, and he wanted to do something rather than nothing. But he never really felt at home. And when Johnny finally moved back into Derry, as I said, I remember going and bringing Johnny back into Derry, and he was glad to be home. He was glad to be back in his city. But like a lot of other people, Johnny had suffered. His family had suffered. Maura, who, you know, myself and Maura had a love-hate relationship. Every time I went down the door, she hit me. You know, but at the same time, I had a great time for Maura, and always did have. And I used to land, and if I had a few bob, I'd call for Johnny and take him out for a drink or whatever, and then me and him were never allowed back in the house again for days later and so on. But that was the nature of life. But unfortunately, Johnny, and I believe he's not the only person who has suffered like this. After all of the troubles and all of the commitment and all of the strife and all of the hardship, Johnny, like some other people, ended up taking drink to a point where it didn't do him any good. And Johnny suffered as a result of that. And I think at one point I had got myself involved in the Rosemount Resource Centre. I do a lot of community work, some people may know, and I asked Johnny would he come and help. And again, in the midst of all of this, where Johnny had his own demons to work with, and maybe his own regrets and so on, and his own wishes and his own dreams as they were to go, he still said yes, and he came up on the IRSP Centre, and he did work like welfare rights. He was helping people to get benefits. You know, Johnny was always struggling where people needed the help. In Dublin, when he was involved down there, he got involved. I remember one particular incident, he got involved by a young girl who was a prostitute, who was being used by local criminals. They were using her body to make money, and Johnny stood up for her and got her, you know, tried to get her away, and he ended up with somebody got into a row where Paddy Brown got a beating. Johnny got a beating because he stood up for a wee girl in Dublin to try and help her away from prostitution. Johnny came to Derry, as I said. Johnny worked on welfare rights. He was helping old people get benefits and so on. Nothing was beyond what Johnny saw as a political commitment or a political task, and Johnny worked with it. Johnny, at the end of it all, Maura died, and I think that's finished Johnny. And unfortunately, I remember when Maura died, I actually wasn't in the country, I was in France, and I didn't get to Maura's funeral. And after we came back, and I spoke to Johnny about it, and we both shed a tear. And I always regret not having been there for Johnny at the time of Maura's death. But just to conclude, I have met many people in my life. Most of the people that have been friends have remained friends through thick and thin for many, many years. I've met shallow friends that come and go. But there are one or two people in my life that I would look to, and I would basically call them heroes, and they would certainly be my heroes. One was Seamus Costello, who was a man that I would have modelled my politics on, and that I would always remember and would always stand up for. But I think, believe it or not, even higher than Seamus Costello, I would hold Johnny White, because I think Johnny is to me the epitome of what a revolutionary is about. It's someone who comes from the working class, who never ever deserted the working class, who never made a penny out of his troubles or out of his struggle for the working class, and who died a hero and a socialist. And that Johnny was a friend and a comrade. And that's as much as I'd like to say. Thank you.
Brilliant reason about Tommy, about Johnny, and I think we should be mindful too that Tommy is just recovering from major surgery as well, and he's here against his own doctor's order, so I think he is. If it's okay with everybody, we should just crack on rather than have an hour break, if that's okay. Does anybody feel that they need to use a bar? So I would just like to, I was mistaken when I said that Tommy was a man of few words, obviously. But now for the main He made a speech about the politics of Johnny White, his friend and comrade Derry Robson.
I've been told to cut this presentation in half. But like everybody else, I don't go that way at all. I was asked to make this presentation because very few people know of Johnny White. So sorry. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yeah. But as complex a life as Johnny had, and Tommy set it out for you in no small manner, it's important to set out as well the context in which Johnny was involved and in which Johnny lived, because very few people live the kind of life that Johnny White lived. Most people who had to face the rigours and the problems that he had to face would have given up years and years and years ago unless they were being offered something else. And for Johnny, of course, that something else was his politics and the socialism which he espoused. So I've written this presentation because I want to try and encapsulate some sense of how things were at that time, and the politics, that is the nature of the ideas and the philosophies that we were all involved in. There were times, for example, in the early 70s when our lives were taken up by politics. That these meetings like this would have been a regular weekly experience where we would have met in bars, sometimes in back rooms, but always attempting to find ways and means of solving the problems that the working class had to face in cities like Derry. So I'm going to read this to give you a sense of what it is, or what it was. In 1970, with Tommy and others, I was a member of the Young Socialists. But it was a chance meeting with Johnny and Joe Sweeney, who was also very prominently involved at the time, at the bottom of Westland Street towards the end of 1970, which would prove to be, for me, a life-changing moment. I had just been released from a 6-month sentence for incitement, and on return to the city discovered that most of my comrades in the Young Socialists had disappeared. Some genuinely felt under threat from the state forces of the RUC and the British Army, whilst others took advantage of the lull to leave the city in search for employment. And that was perfectly natural. At that time, I didn't know Johnny very well, although I was more than aware of his reputation as a local leader and of his clear understanding of the political crisis we were in, and with the threat of internment faced by each and every one of us. It's not an easy task to set out the reasons for presenting a paper on Johnny's influence on the politics of this period. I can say without fear of contradiction that his view represented the politics of generations of revolutionaries who remained rigidly aware that the struggle for national independence can only be led by the working class. Insofar as he was aware of having what could be described as a world view, Johnny would have subscribed to the traditionally Marxist view of the struggle in Ireland as one which is led by the working class, and one which can only be won by the most politically advanced sections of the Irish working class. But for those who are critical of the armed struggle in the North, and there are plenty of them, remember what Lenin said of the search for the pure revolution when he argued that they would never live to see it. Such a person, Lenin insisted, pays lip service to revolution without understanding what revolution is. To say that the historical and political issues of the involvement of Britain in Ireland is less important than the class struggle is both historically inaccurate as well as being politically immature. For many of us who understood these questions, the answer to many of the problems of clarity can be found in Connolly's writings, in which, for example, he said, "If you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about the organisation of the Socialist Republic, your efforts would be in vain. England would still rule you, She would rule you through her capitalists, through her landlords, through her financiers, through the whole array of commercial and individualist institutions she has planted in this country and watered with the tears of our mothers and the blood of our martyrs. England would still rule you to your ruin, even while your lips offered hypocritical homage at the shrine of that freedom whose cause you had betrayed. It would, I think, be no exaggeration to suggest that those words written by Connolly proved to be the most profound statement of the principles of Johnny White throughout the course of his active life until his death 5 short years ago. In spite of the problems he was to face in the years since the beginning of the struggle against British imperialism, Johnny remained true to his principles and to his loyalty to the socialism of Connolly and, of course, of Seamus Costello. But before I focus on the influence of Johnny on the politics of Republican socialism in Ireland, it would be important to examine his involvement in the development of Republican socialism, and in particular, the formation of the IRSP. There are probably several accounts of those who helped to form the IRSP, each having a different perspective on how it was formed, when it was formed, and of course, most importantly, why it was formed. But for those of us who were influenced by Johnny's breadth of vision and unwavering commitment to the Socialist Republic of James Connolly, the starting point for many of us was the decision to openly challenge the official leadership at the Ardèche in the presentation of what became known as the Donegal Amendment in 1972. The amendment was drawn up by a small number of activists from Donegal, Derry and Dublin, and although Seamus Costello was unable to participate, he warmly welcomed the decision to challenge the opportunism of the leadership and promised his support and the support of the Wicklow members. A fundamental tenet of the amendment was the call into account of the official IRA leadership for the decision to announce the declaration of a ceasefire without taking into account the views of the rank and file throughout the country. The amendment pointed to the attempt by the provisionals to form an all-class alliance with elements within Fianna Fáil. The amendment, which also proposed that the democratic decisions of the mass of volunteers to continue to engage in an armed resistance against the British occupation, be implemented. It was proposed by Johnny White and seconded by Seamus Costello. So what was the amendment and why was it regarded as important to the developments which were taking place in the official Republican movement at that time? It was felt by some that the decision by the IRA leadership to call a ceasefire in 1972 would not only result in a failure to take advantage of the weakening six-county state, the political and military defeat of unionism, and the rise of the reactionary and opportunist provisionals. Even when we were conscious of the rise of middle-class elements in the provisionals who held political ambitions and who saw the political defeat of the SDLP as the first step in their plan to replace the SDLP as the political leadership of Northern nationalism. The elevation of Sinn Féin to local government with Martin McGuinness as Deputy First Minister was seen, even at that time, as inevitable, with the logical next step being the replacement in the Free State of Fianna Fáil and the strengthening of Sinn Féin in Leinster House. Johnny would have argued with this analysis, Johnny would have agreed with this analysis and would have been of the view that only the building of a class-conscious Socialist Republican Party in the tradition of James Connolly would be in a position to challenge the sectarianism of the Unionist state and the blatant opportunism of Sinn Féin. Many of these issues were contained in the Donegal Amendment, of which Johnny was one of the authors. The fact that he was chosen as the delegate with sufficient authority to appeal to the membership over the heads of the leadership is proof positive of his influence at that moment in time. It is probably correct to say that if it had not been for his deep understanding of the leadership of the Republican movement before the split in 1969-1970, and his very clear belief that those who split with the formation of the Provisional IRA would eventually form an all-class alliance with anyone who would give them access to the corridors of power in Stormont and Leinster House, that convinced him that a new formation of political understandings were both inevitable and necessary. Since then, we have witnessed the demise in the 26 counties of Fianna Fáil and the dramatic rise of Sinn Féin. And who would have predicted 20 years ago the alliance in government in the north, in the partition stormont of Sinn Féin, and the deeply sectarian DUP. Although Johnny left the IRSP shortly after its formation because of his frustration at the failure of the leadership to address the dichotomy and the contradiction of having two separate political leaderships, one representing the party and the other representing the army, in spite of his long illness, he returned to his political home in the IRSP. To fully understand the reasons for Johnny's apparent change of direction, it would be important to examine the basis for the formation of the IRSP and the INLA. Most founding members of the Irish Republican Socialist Party and Irish National Liberation Army came out of the official Republican movement. Provisional Sinn Féin and the Provisional IRA had split from what became known as the officials in late 1969 and early 1970, ostensibly over Sinn Féin's decision to drop its traditional position of abstentionism in regard to Dáil Éireann. But the cleavage represented divisions of a deeper nature concerning the officials' analysis, presented by, for example, by Owen Harris and others. Following the departure of the provisionals, a section of the officials' leadership used bureaucratic manipulation and subterfuge to cripple internal democracy, thereby permitting them to push through a ceasefire in mid-1972 and to steer a course towards political reformism. Thwarted in attempts to alter the direction of the officials, the left socialist Republicans left the movement en masse and with like-minded independent activists founded the Irish Republican Socialist Party and Irish National Liberation Army in December the 10th, 1970 in the robbery of a mail train. Although the provisionals were eventually pressurised into accepting responsibility for carrying out the action. The charges against all of the Republican Socialists except one were eventually overturned on the basis of evidence that the Garda had used torture to extract confessions from the accused. The lone conviction remaining after the original trials was finally pardoned after a lengthy hunger strike by IRSP prisoner Nicky Kelly in Portlaoise prison nearly toppled the Dublin government in the occupied 6 counties. In the occupied 6 counties, the shoot-to-kill policy of the British Army and the supergrass system of using paid perjurers to obtain mass arrests were both used against the Irish Republican Socialist movement in numbers greatly disproportionate to the size of the IRSM. SAS assassination squads masquerading as loyalists carried out the murders of IRSP and Nationalist Bloc Armagh committee leaders Miriam Davey, Ronnie Bunting and Noah Little in a manner unprecedented in modern Irish history. The 1981 hunger strike resulted in the death of 3 INLA prisoners of war, again greatly disproportionate to the size of the IRSM's prison population. INLA Chief of Staff Dominic McGlinchey became the most wanted man in both the 6 and 26 counties, as well as the first Republican to be extradited by the Dublin government to the occupied 6 counties. Indeed, the Dublin regime have supported more extraditions of IRSM members into British custody than any other Republican organisation. Beginning in the mid-1980s, Provisional Sinn Féin displayed a policy of hostility towards the IRSM. This included the refusal to share a platform with the IRSP, eventually leading Sinn Féin to launch a counter-demonstration against the long-established Manchester Martyrs commemoration and to exclude the IRSM from the 10th anniversary commemoration of the 1981 hunger strike, in which 3 of the 10 who died were INLA members. Johnny warned at that time that such developments were an inevitable consequence of the increasing dominance of the provisional leadership's thirst for power. The increasing attacks on the IRSM from the state, north and south, as well as from several opportunist groups, led the socialist activist Bernadette McAlliskey to call it, the IRSP, the most persecuted movement in Irish history. The IRSP has survived in spite of these attacks, and as a consequence, Johnny White felt it necessary to return and offer his support. What would Johnny White think of the developments which have taken place in the years since his formation, in which he served as Ardcordia member and as the first Adjutant General of the Irish National Liberation Army? It is worth mentioning just a few of them. The Irish Republican Socialist movement reintroduced the revolutionary analysis that presented to Ireland by James Connolly that national liberation is an aspect of the struggle for socialism, and the two cannot be separated. Ending partition without overthrowing the Dublin neo-colonial regime, without ending imperialist economic domination of Ireland, cannot bring about national liberation. Consequently, or conversely, the struggle for socialism is impeded by partition, which arrests the development of class consciousness by the workers of both states. Both Johnny and Seamus Costello were actively involved in supporting the building of an anti-imperialist broad front of organisations and activists. Although the Provos consistently rejected the idea through their H-Block representative Barbara de Bruyn, the IRSP effectively coordinated a number of campaigns with People's Democracy and other activists. The strength of the IRSP's position became clear during the hunger strikes, when the H-Block Armagh Committee demonstrated the strength gained from anti-imperialist unity. Seamus Costello was elected to Bray Urban Council and Wicklow County Council, where he was a model of socialist electoral intervention. He used his office to empower local workers to fight for their own interests. His campaign for re-election was supported by members such as Tommy McCourt and Johnny White. In spite of the attempt by the establishment to claim that the struggle in the North was a sectarian one, the IRSP analysis of loyalism remains unique amongst Irish Republicans and Socialists. While rejecting sectarianism based on religious affiliation, counting the IRSP recognizes loyalism as a reactionary ideology with which Republicans and Socialists cannot compromise. Irish Republican Socialist prisoners of war were actively involved in blanket and dirty protests against criminalisation of political prisoners, with the highest ratio of prisoners participating of any Republican organisation. IRSP POWs participated in the 1980 and 1981 hunger strikes. 3 of the 10 prisoners who died in hunger strike in 1981, O'Hara, Lynch and Devine, were IMLA volunteers. IRSP was among the most active supporters of the Relatives Action Committee and later the National H-Block Armagh Committee campaign for Irish POWs. IRSP comrades Miriam Daly and Noel Little were killed in 2 of the 4 assassination attempts in 1980 against the national leadership of the H-Block Committee, with John Turnley of the Irish Independence Party and Bernadette McAlliskey and IRSP activist Ronnie Bunting, who was also killed along with Noel Little. IRSP proclaimed solidarity for other anti-imperialist struggles regularly in its press, with articles in support of Palestinian, Angolan, Salvadorian, Iranian, Native American, African American, Basque, South African and many other struggles. In the 1980s, the IRSP coordinated an Irish-speaking tour for the Pan-Africanist Congress. The IRSP joined the campaign to boycott the Northern Ireland Assembly elections with the Independence Party and others, despite the SDLP and Sinn Féin standing candidates for the resurrected Stormont. The IRSP was one of the first parties to make a detailed analysis of multinational corporations' impact on Ireland, publishing findings that Ireland is among the world's most exploited economies by multinationals. The IRSP also exposed loyalist death squads and their links to international fascist groups in South Africa and Israel. With the honourable exception of Seamus Costello and local leaders such as Johnny White, the problem lay in the officials' leadership's inability to step back from their support for traditional Irish republicanism, with its predisposition for militarism, conspiracy, secrecy and reformism, as well as their fleeting flirtation with Stalinism. Furthermore, calls for participation in the trade union movement and the building of an anti-imperialist front went largely unheeded by the trade union leadership and its members. Against that background, the armed struggle appears to bring more tangible results. It would be churlish to ignore the fact that the call for a ballot box and Armalite strategy had a seductive appeal, although many of us believe that the opportunism of the provisionals would lead them into a political cul-de-sac. In 1981, the impressive election of Bobby Sands was one example of the success of this strategy, and of the provisional appetite for seizing the opportunity. In spite of the wider support for participation in elections, the disenchantment with traditional republicanism reached its peak with the ceasefire declaration by the Provisional IRA. Disillusionment led to the formation of new groups and the subsequent demonizing of their members by former comrades. These events merely confirmed for many not just the futility of engaging in an armed conflict which achieved nothing more than the appointment of Sinn Féin leaders to executive positions, but the fundamental reformist nature of a republicanism which did not locate itself firmly within an understanding of the class nature of the state. If they had understood that, they could not possibly have gone into government with the DUP, the most reactionary and blatantly sectarian political party. They had in effect elected to become the joint administrators of the new reformed six-county state of Northern Ireland. When Johnny said that the Provisionals would eventually become the managers of the British state of Northern Ireland, he was closer to the truth than perhaps even he had thought. When he said that the Provisionals would become the policemen of the new so-called dispensation, he wasn't very far from the truth. They have become the cheerleaders of the attempt by Britain to strengthen their hegemony in the north. Johnny knew this, and his decision to return to full membership of the IRSP is evidence of his clarity of thought and understanding of the processes of political opportunism. It's not as if the lessons weren't there for everyone to see. Just 22 years before the provisional ceasefire of 1994, the declaration of a ceasefire by the official IRA and the suspicion in which Johnny White and the Derry Socialist Republicans were held would eventually lead to their exclusion and eventual expulsion. The widespread use of kangaroo courts by the official IRA and the demonising of volunteers were merely a mask for those in the official Sinn Féin and IRA leadership who were preparing the way for the continuing reform of the movement, the election of TDs to Leinster House, and possible future alliance with one of the three main parties in the south. It would be true to suggest that Johnny warned all of us that the Provos would end up in this same cul-de-sac, although few of us would have predicted the extent of their collaboration. Few of us could have imagined a level of political prostitution practiced by the provisional leadership. But of all those who were active throughout the course of the most recent conflict, and who understood fully the nature of the Great Compromise, there were those who kept their eyes on the ball and who were able to predict the nature of the sellout, which is provisional republicanism. But the flag was raised in 1974 when those who were expelled came together in a new development in Lucan to form the basis for a new political order to expose the opportunism of the leadership of both the official and provisional IRA and create the foundation for a new political movement based on the central role of the Irish working class, which would take up the struggle against imperialism in all its forms and provide the basis for an alternative political leadership. Against that background, we can never forget Seamus Costello and Johnny White, who stand out as the architects of the new development, who recognise the umbilical nature of the link between the national and class questions. Connolly identified the repressive nature of the problem. He said, "If you strike at, imprison or kill us, out of our prisons or graves we will still evoke a spirit that will thwart you and perhaps raise a force that will destroy you. We defy you, do your worst." They did their worst, but the movement they helped create defied them all and remains as the only principled political alternative. If it had not been for the leadership provided by Seamus Costello and Johnny White, that alternative would have dissipated and disappeared. It is for that reason and all of the additional reasons that we have gathered here to commemorate our fallen comrades, and in particular to recognise and celebrate the political legacy of our friend and comrade Johnny White.
thanks very much to Terry for his brilliant lecture. I'd just again like to thank you all for coming here, and it was a really truly fitting day for Johnny, and thank you all very much.
They're trying to get copies of
And there's sandwiches here, sorry, there's sandwiches here, look, everybody just working on it.